Good morning. That was pretty good. Wasn't better than Jeff's, but it was pretty good. We're going to be in Mark chapter 1 this morning, if you'll go ahead and turn there. Mark chapter 1. I shared my first Sunday that I preached here as your pastor, the story of the first sermon that I delivered, which went horribly wrong, if you remember that. Also during that week, and I don't know if I mentioned this whenever I was sharing about that disastrous, though exegetically correct sermon, that week at camp where I preached that sermon that was very, very poor and that went very, very badly was also a terrible week. That was the first time, and maybe a little bit of context here, I was the kid who was afraid to do overnight things, right? Maybe you were that kid growing up, or maybe you had that kid growing up where it was like, I don't want to go do camp. I don't want to go away from my parents. I don't want to travel overnight. I was kind of like super sheltered, didn't want to stray far away from mom and dad, especially then, which was around 4th, 5th grade. But my parents convinced me that year to go to camp, which really I could blame them for that bad sermon that was preached, I guess. But they convinced me to go to camp, and I really had no idea what I was doing. I packed my own bag, and that was a mistake. Packing for camp, I only packed one pair of shoes. Now, I don't know if you've ever gone a week out in the wilderness with only one pair of shoes, but it's a poor decision, a very poor decision. Little did I know while packing for camp that whole week at camp was going to be nothing but water activities, swimming, and getting wet. So I go to camp with one pair of Walmart tennis shoes to get soaked the whole entire week. And let me tell you, that was a decision that cost me. Every day we would go and we would get wet. We'd play with water guns, water balloons. We'd wade in the creek, whatever it might be. We would just get soaked. And by the end of day 2, I was the stinkiest kid at that entire church camp. Those shoes smelled like a swamp. I don't know if you've ever smelled a swamp, but it's not a pleasant experience to smell a swamp. I smelled like that. The shoes were wet. They never got dry. Everywhere I walked, there was that squishy, squashy sound. You know what I'm talking about when your tennis shoes are wet? You could just hear me coming from like a mile away. It was terrible. And it was so bad, and I don't know if you know this about some types of spiders. In Missouri, we have crazy spiders. But there's a certain kind of spider, there's really a couple kind of spiders in Missouri that like wet, damp places, dark places. And so on about the 3rd night of this week at camp, I was like walking around barefoot because my feet were so like wrinkled from the water in the shoes that I just left my shoes in the room all day. And we came back that night and somebody accidentally kicked my shoe over and it fell over, and a spider, I kid you not, that big, fell out of it. And then our room leader stomped on the spider, and it happened to be one of those spiders that carries like thousands of babies on its back. And so all of those little spiders just like spread across the whole room. I'm really glad it got knocked over so I didn't wear them, because that would have been a very uncomfortable thing to feel in my shoe. But nonetheless, it was a bad deal. Only packing one pair of shoes for that week of camp was very costly. It made me the stinky kid. It created spider problems, and it just resulted in general discomfort. Decisions like that can cost you in life. What I want to look at this morning is the fact that deciding to follow after Jesus is a costly decision. It's a costly decision. Following Jesus will cost you something. So what we're going to do this morning, as we get into the sermon, we're actually going to be getting into a new sermon series. Last week we wrapped up a sermon series on the church. We looked at a lot of different aspects in theology about what the church is, what the church does. This week we're starting a sermon series on the mission of the church, namely evangelism and missions. And so for the next 6 weeks or so, we're going to look at the call in the New Testament to be a people who reaches out to the world with the gospel. Because as we just shared a few moments ago, as we looked and had our missions moment, there's great need for the gospel outside of these 4 walls. And so what I want to do as we hop into this first sermon and begin to talk about these things is look at the cost of discipleship. That's the title of the message this morning, the cost of discipleship, where we're going to see that following Jesus is a costly decision that will cost you really your whole life and will result in you being a disciple who makes disciples. I think that this is the most fitting place that we could start a sermon series on missions and evangelism, or the mission of the church, because only disciples of Jesus can make more disciples, right? In order to make somebody into something, you have to be that something. And so starting by talking about discipleship and what it means to follow Jesus, and as we look at this text, what it means to be someone who is a fisher of men, we're going to see the connection between discipleship and evangelism. That the thing that we do in reaching the lost and dying world comes from what we are, the fact that we follow Jesus with really wholesale abandon, that we've pursued him, that we're letting go of our lives in order to obey him and fulfill the Great Commission. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning in Mark chapter 1. The church exists to equip believers for the work of the ministry, right? We really talked about that a lot in this past sermon series on the church. We looked at the fact that the church is to be about equipping the saints to go and do the work of the ministry, and that would include being a people who goes and makes disciples. It's often debated in kind of pastoral leadership circles what the purpose of the church is. If you ask some people, they'll say that the purpose of the church is solely outside of these doors, that the church's main focus is to be about the Great Commission, to be about missions and evangelism and making disciples. But then if you ask others, some will say that the church's sole focus is the building up of believers, teaching sound doctrine, equipping the saints, feeding the sheep. And so what you'll find oftentimes is that churches either fall into one of those two categories on kind of a spectrum, being more about outreach and evangelism, or being more about what happens in this room. And so you'll find churches that kind of teeter-totter on this spectrum. But what we see in the scriptures is that we need to find ourselves comfortably in the middle. We have to be both things. We have to be a people that's about equipping and growing and living holy lives, and be a people that are about reaching the lost. And so this idea that the church is supposed to equip the saints for the work of the ministry flows into that, because what we do here on Sunday morning isn't just supposed to stay in these four walls, right? We come into church, we are equipped with the word, equipped through the gifts and the ministries of one another, and then we go out of these doors to reach the lost. It's a both and. We're to be about equipping and building up the body and reaching the lost. It's not one or the other. And what you'll often find is you'll find churches that focus too much on outreach or social justice or impacting the world, so much so that they neglect spiritual development and doctrine. And they kind of just become a place that's about trying to lure in unbelievers. But then on the other side, you have churches that focus too much on the equipping of the saints, so much so that they lose the Great Commission, and it just becomes about what we know and how we grow, and not about reaching the lost. We cannot afford, as a church, to fall too much on one end of the spectrum. We have to be both. And so in this series and in this sermon, what I want us to do is really I want to encourage us to embrace the mission that God has given us to reach the nation with the gospel, but to do so in a way that doesn't neglect the equipping of the saints. So, to start us off with this sermon series, that was a long front porch, but what I want to do, as I said, is look at the connection between discipleship and evangelism this morning. Maybe we could say it like this: if you are a disciple, a follower of Jesus Christ, you are also a fisher of men. If you have followed Jesus, if you became a disciple of Jesus, you are to be about discipling or making disciples of others. And this decision to follow Jesus, to be his disciple, to be like him, is a costly decision, as we're going to look at in this text. So let's go ahead and let's read this passage. If you would, Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 16, we're going to see that disciples make disciples. Look at verse 16 with me. Passing along the Sea of Galilee, he, that's Jesus, saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. Let's pray together this morning. Lord, help us to see what it means to follow you, what it means to be a disciple, to be a Christian. Lord, that it's not something trivial and small, that it's not something that we can dilute down to just attendance and showing up for a service once a week, but that it's a call to serve you with our whole lives. Lord, that following you costs us our life. Lord, that it encompasses our whole life. Lord, help us to see the weight of what it means to follow you this morning. Lord, also help us to be made passionate about making disciples. Lord, fundamental to what it means to be a follower of you is to be a fisher of men, to go after and pursue people with the gospel. Lord, encourage us this morning towards evangelism. Help us to see that evangelism comes out of what we are, followers of you. Be with us now as we study and look at these 4 truths about discipleship this morning. It's your name I pray. Amen. 4 truths about discipleship. First, discipleship is initiated by Jesus. Discipleship is initiated by Jesus. We see this in verses 16 and 20. In those 2 verses, we find Jesus walking down the seashore of Galilee, and he approaches 2 different sets of fishermen. The first is Peter or Simon and Andrew, and then he approaches James and John, the sons of Zebedee, as they are mending their nets in their boat with their father. Verse 16 says that Jesus asked Peter and Andrew to follow him, and verse 20 says that he called James and John. The word called in verse 20 being a common New Testament word used to describe calling in the terms of salvation and sanctification of the believer. Now, it's important to see Jesus' calling of his disciples here in verse 16 and 20 with the understanding of the context of the time. Jesus was what is called a rabbi. He was a teacher of the law. And it's important to recognize this because what Jesus is doing in calling these disciples here in these few verses is something that's very countercultural to the time that he was living in. You see, rabbis or teachers of the law in this day would often have followers or disciples who would learn from them and sit under their teaching. It was something that was really a normal occurrence during the time. So it's not unusual that Jesus wants followers or has followers or disciples, but the way that this happens, the way that Jesus gets these followers, these disciples, is different from how it actually worked at the time. The way that a rabbi would typically get a follower or a disciple in the first century was that disciple would approach the rabbi. They would come to them and basically ask permission to be able to follow that teacher. Maybe a modern parallel that we could use to think this through would be applying for a college, right? Whenever you apply for a college, you'll fill out a form. Nowadays, it's done online. You fill it out. You'll attach your SAT score, your ACT score, your GPA from high school, all that fun stuff, and you apply to go to that college. Essentially, following after a rabbi in this time worked in a similar way. Worked in a similar way. You had to go and approach the person you wanted to learn from, and hopefully you would essentially get in and get to be their follower. But that's not what Jesus does here, is it? They're not applying to be in the Jesus Bible College of Galilee or something like that. There's no application, there's no SAT scores or anything like that. Instead, in our passage, Jesus goes to Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Jesus approaches them. And that was unheard of during this time. Again, the ones who wanted to learn from a teacher would go to him. The teacher would not stoop down and go to people to ask them to follow him. This is completely the opposite of how it was supposed to work during this day. Jesus called them to follow him. He didn't wait for them to come to him. He pursued them. Jesus calls his disciples. What we really see here is a glorious picture of the gospel and of our salvation. And this picture reminds us that God is not passive or idle when it comes to saving sinners. He comes to us. He approaches us. He pursues us. We have a problem in the American church today. We have a small view of God and a weak view of the gospel. Small view of God and a weak view of the gospel. We see God as kind of passive or idle in the salvation of sinners. Just kind of sits back and hopes that they come to him. Maybe when you were in high school or junior high, you did this. You don't have to raise your hand and embarrass yourself and admit to this, but maybe you relate to this. Maybe you once passed a love note to someone back in the day. You wrote on a little piece of paper, "Do you like me? Check yes or no." Or, "How do you feel about me? I have a crush on you. What say you?" And fill in the blank or something along those lines. And you passed that note to somebody you were crushing on, hoping that they would like you back. That's oftentimes how the American church views the gospel. It's oftentimes how the American church thinks about God's role in the calling and salvation of sinners. Like God is up in heaven, and he's kind of just sent us a love note in Jesus' Son, and he's up there kind of pacing back and forth on the floor, wringing his hands, biting his nails, just hoping that we will like him back and respond to him with the same affection. We talk about the gospel like God is insecure, hoping his plan to save sinners will work. But the truth of the matter is that God does not sit back. He pursues sinners. John, in his first epistle, says that we love him because he first loved us. God is not slack. It is not up in the air with him. He's not idle. He's not passive in the calling out of sinners. This is the beauty of the gospel. He hunts us down. He pursues the weak and the unlovable. He calls men and women to follow after him. He goes to where we are. He pursues us. This is massively important for how we understand our salvation for two reasons. First, the evangelistic reason, and second, a practical reason. First, let's talk about the evangelistic one. If God is not passive in saving sinners, or maybe to put it in a different way, if God isn't hands-off with the Great Commission, but hands-on, then when it comes to sharing the gospel as a church and doing missions or doing evangelism, we don't have to rely on our performance, but his power. You see what I'm saying? If God is active in saving and changing sinners, and it's on him to save and change and to bring people into the faith, then when it comes to the moment of sharing the gospel, doing missions, it's not based on my performance or what I say or what I do, but on his power. And that, church, should liberate you. Salvation is not accomplished by our own strength, but by his grace. So when we take the gospel to the nations, confidence is in him and not in me. And this is liberating because sharing the gospel can be intimidating and hard at times. It can be a little bit scary. But when I realize that it's on him, that change rests on him, that drawing and calling rest on him, I can rest in his power and not fear and not worry whenever I'm sharing the gospel. His power in salvation and calling sinners is the fuel for bold obedience to the Great Commission. knowing that God is sovereign, knowing that God calls and saves sinners, is the fuel to be obedient to the Great Commission, because we can go out with confidence, not in ourselves, but in Him and His work. It's God who calls and saves sinners. He makes the first move. Second, the practical reason why this matters. This eliminates the fact that it's God who comes to us and approaches us and saves sinners. This eliminates all room for boasting. All room for boasting. Paul says in his letters that it's by grace and not by works. That we don't save ourselves, that we don't come to God, that God takes the first step, and it's by His gracious initiative that we are saved. We don't even start the process. He comes for us. Christ has done it all for us. What a grace this morning. That Jesus comes and saves sinners. That He approaches us. That He goes to where we are. He does all the work. Second truth this morning about discipleship. Christ's call is for the unexpected. Discipleship is for the unexpected. Discipleship is for the unexpected. Look at who He calls in verse 16 and verse 19. He calls fishermen. Lowly, backwater fishermen to be His first disciples. A fisherman at this time in the first century was about as low on the ladder of society as you could go. Lowest of the low. Not people of significance, not people of influence, not people of cultural weight or leadership. He calls fishermen. Jesus goes to those that you might not expect. You might not expect for Him to use to start the church, write most of the New Testament, and take the gospel to the then known ends of the earth. He uses and calls the unexpected. Not only were they fishermen, but even worse, they're fishermen from the Capernaum and Galilee area. And if you don't know what the significance of that was during this time, basically picture it like the ghetto of Israel at the time. All right? This is the place where that's not great. A little bit rough, right? I don't know what the equivalent to like the ghetto is here in New York. I'm still new here. For me, out in the country, that's like hillbilly redneck territory, right? And if you thought that I am a hillbilly or a redneck, I'm going to take you down south, and you're going to realize that me saying y'all isn't nothing. It ain't nothing. There's another hillbilly word, ain't. They're from a rougher part of Israel at the time. Galilee, fishermen, from a backwater place where nobody really knows anything about them. He uses them to start the church and take the gospel to the ends of the earth. Jesus calls the unexpected to be His disciples. He calls the unexpected to use for the expansion of His kingdom. And what this shows us this morning is that God's kingdom is an upside-down kingdom where He uses the weak and the unexpected to do His work. Do you know this morning that God can use even me and you for the expansion of His kingdom and the furtherance of the gospel? Do you know this morning that God can use you, no matter who you are, where you came from, how insignificant you might think that you are in the grand scheme of things, God can use you for the furtherance of His gospel and the kingdom. He calls fishermen. One of my dear brothers in the faith is currently serving out a 18-and-a-half-year prison sentence. Whenever I was 14 or so, I met this man, and he's a dear, sweet friend of mine. I met him in that prayer meeting that I mentioned last week. We would gather together and we pray together. From there, him and I, we began to serve on a bus ministry for Freeway Ministries, which was this recovery ministry that I served in Springfield. We would go and we'd ride the bus together and we'd pick people up. We'd take them to this worship service where they get food and hear the gospel. But during that time, whenever I met him, he was going through a series of court cases, trials for a crime that he had committed, a crime that is so horrible and so bad that I wouldn't even dare mention it this morning to you. For Christ, he did horrible, horrible, horrible things. unimaginable things. But Jesus saved him. Jesus called him. And his life was radically changed. He went from being one thing, doing horrible things, to being a godly man, sold out, committed to serving the church, committed to sharing the gospel with everyone he met. A great man of God, despite who he used to be. I remember when I was 14, 15, sitting in those last few court sessions, sitting behind him as the judge was making the call on what would happen to him. I remember seeing the evidence put up on screen of the things that he did, unimaginable things. He was guilty, deserving of punishment. Got sentenced again to 18 and a half years. He's been there. He's served out a good portion of that at this point. That was a while ago. He calls me and my dad every now and then to update us. I visited him a few years back in prison. Got to sit with him for an hour. Told me, I'm here. I'm in prison. I'm leading Bible studies. I'm sharing the gospel. Discipling men. Being a light here in prison. It's not ideal, it's not optimal, but God is using me here. God can use the unexpected. If he can use someone who committed unimaginable crimes in an unimaginable context to share the gospel, imagine what he could do with you. God calls the unexpected. He uses the unexpected. Discipleship is for the unexpected. He took a bunch of backwater fishermen and used them to start the church, to write the New Testament and evangelize the world. What can he do with you this morning? Despite where you came from, despite who you are, despite what you've done, despite your current circumstances, what can he do with you this morning if you'll follow him with all that you have? Calls for the unexpected. Don't you ever doubt this morning that God can use you, that God can work through your life, and that God can use your witness and your testimony for his glory and for the expansion of the gospel. God uses the unexpected. Third truth this morning about discipleship. Disciples make disciples. Disciples make disciples. Jesus asked them to follow him in verses 16 and 19, and then in verse 17, he says he will make them fishers of men. Look at verse 17 with me again. And Jesus said to them, follow me. So there's stepping out and following Jesus. And I will make you become fishers of men. First, note how the disciples become fishers of men. Notice the wording there in verse 17. Jesus says he makes them become. Something that Jesus does. Jesus makes them become fishers of men. Brothers and sisters, I want you to hear this morning. There are no self-made disciples of Jesus. No self-made disciples of Jesus. You are what you are, and you're used as you're used by his power and by his glory, not from something that you do. The credit goes to him. It is Jesus who turns you, who makes you become what you need to be. It is Jesus who makes you something into something that you're not on your own. It's Jesus who makes you able to share the gospel. And this, again, takes us back to the truth that when it comes to evangelism, it's not about our performance, but his power. You being what you need to be a fisher of men comes from him. Not only does he supply what is needed to change those who we share the gospel with, but he also changes you to be able to share the gospel. Gives us everything we need. He doesn't call us and say, good luck figuring this out on your own. He doesn't make us, he does. He makes us into what he has called us to be by the Spirit through the Word. Change isn't on us, it's on Christ who changes and remakes us. If you are frustrated this morning with your failings at evangelism or even just Christianity, may I just kindly push you and just motivate you to rely on him to change you and to make you into what you are not. Now, what does it mean to be a fisher of men? It's kind of a weird phrase. We know what it means. We know that it means that we're supposed to be people who go and make disciples, that we share the gospel, that we seek people out. But What exactly did it mean then in this context? Well, I think really getting a picture for how fishing worked whenever Jesus approached these disciples will maybe help you understand exactly what Jesus is saying here. So let's go back to the first century for a second and think about fishing. It's not really what we think about when we think about fishing here in America. Fishing during this day, as Simon and Andrew and James and John would have done it, was done with these giant ring-shaped nets, huge, big old ring-shaped nets. And on these nets, they would tie rocks and metal chunks to these nets to weigh them down. And they would use these nets to fish in two ways. If you were fishing from on the shore, like Simon and Andrew are in these verses, what you would do is you would throw these big heavy nets out into the water, and then you would go out into the water and you drag them full of fish back to shore. Doesn't sound very relaxing, does it? You drag them back to shore. You get in the water. You pull the fish back. Or, if you were on a boat like James and John are, as we see in verses 19 and 20, you'd throw these big heavy nets overboard, and then you would pull them up with a rope with the fish pulling against you. And you'd fight, and you'd get these big heavy nets full of rock and metal, and you'd yank it onto your boat. Yank it up. Fishing was hard in the first century. It was difficult. And just to go back to what I said about fishing from the shore, if you were fishing on the shore, sometimes this meant literally diving into the water and swimming with it. In the water, pulling against fish that are pulling the opposite direction. It's a very kind of graphic, vivid picture of evangelism, is it not? In the water, pulling, fighting, struggling. It's crucial to see here the difference between this version of fishing and maybe what our version of fishing is, so that we don't really misunderstand what Jesus is actually saying when he says becoming a fisher, or make you to become a fisher of men, right? See the contrast just to help us understand this better. He's not talking about sitting on a chair or a fishing boat or a bridge with a rod and a reel and a bobber and a lure. It's not the picture of evangelism here. It's not sitting and waiting, hoping something bites your rod or your lure. It's active. There's a pursuit to it. There's a fight to it. It's not patiently waiting for a fish to get hungry and to bite. This isn't sitting and luring people in. In other words, Jesus' idea of evangelism in this passage of being a fisher of men is not hoping that God comes up in a conversation with a coworker. It's not just kind of passively sitting by, waiting for things to go the right direction so you can mention Jesus and invite somebody to church. It's not the picture Jesus gives us of evangelism here. This convicts the snot out of me. It's getting in the water, pulling against those who don't want to come, striving in the cold and the wet, lifting heavy nets, fighting for souls. That's the picture Jesus gives us of evangelism here, being a fisher of men. He's using what the disciples are doing, what the disciples have in their hands to paint the picture of their task, striving for souls. Not sitting idly by hoping somebody just kind of turns their head in. It's not dressing up the gospel in such a way that it becomes enticing and luring, because when we do that, we lose the gospel. The picture of evangelism here is aggressive. It's forward. It's a desperate struggle. Pursuit. Jesus' call to be fishers of men is not to sit and wait for an opportunity. It is a call to dive into the darkness with sinners and try to pull them out of the water while they are trying to swim down into darkness away from the lights. That's the picture he gives us of evangelism here. It's a dangerous call. We have to get rid of the excuse, I'm just waiting for an opportunity. I'm just waiting for it to come up in conversation. Pursuit. Struggling. Striving. That's what it is to be a fisher of men. To be a disciple is to be a fisher of men, and to be a fisher of men is to fight for the souls of the lost. Desperately, knowing what's at stake. Last this morning, the call of discipleship is costly. Discipleship is costly. Over and over in the Gospels, we see that the call to follow Christ has a cost to it. Grace is free. We were saved by grace through faith. But what it actually means to follow Jesus when we're saved, that has a cost and a weight to it. Christ says that the one who wants to follow after him must take up their cross and deny themselves. He told the rich young ruler to sell his possessions because his possessions were the true God that he was following. That he couldn't really follow Jesus with those things in the way. Jesus said that the man who looks back from the plow is unfit for the kingdom, in response to someone saying they want to say bye to their family before following him. Jesus said if someone does not hate their father and mother in comparison to their love of Christ, they cannot be his disciple. He deemed the man who wanted to bury his own father before following him as unable to follow him. Do you see the cost of discipleship this morning? Here we see in these few verses, the short passage, Peter, Andrew, James, John leave behind their businesses, their families, their boats. They drop, it says, their nets. They leave their nets behind and immediately answer the call to follow Jesus. Right, James and John are standing there in the boat with their dad. Family business. And by the way, having a boat during this time as a fisherman in Galilee meant you were doing really well. They were on the wealthy side. Drop the nets. Follow Jesus. Leave it behind. There's a cost. There's a cost to following Christ. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a book titled The Cost of Discipleship. And in it he wrote these words: when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. If you're familiar with Bonhoeffer, he was a German Lutheran pastor and theologian during the Second World War. And he was executed by the Nazis for pushing back against Hitler and being part of an assassination plot to kill him. They got him and they killed him. A German in the middle of Nazi Germany, willing to stand against his culture and the tide to do what was right in the face of evil, and he lost his life for doing that, for doing what he saw as obeying Christ in that context. What is the cost of discipleship? It's your life, your whole life, given to Jesus, pursuing him, following him. Discipleship is costly. So let me ask some hard questions for us this morning as we kind of begin to wrap this up. What things in your life are you holding on to that are keeping you from fully following Jesus? What are your nets that you need to drop? Keeps you from pursuing him, keeps you from obeying him, keeps you from loving him with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. What is it that gets in the way of you living a sold out, on fire life for Christ? What keeps you? Are you really following him with all that you have? Is he worth more to you than this life here on earth? The Apostle Paul said to live is Christ, to die is gain. Gain. Is Jesus everything to you? It's a hard, introspective question, but I think that this passage puts us up against that mirror to ask ourselves that question. Are we really following him? There's two groups of people in here this morning. There's one group that's been called by Jesus and have heeded that call to follow him, but as time has passed in your Christian life, you have picked up stuff in this world. It might be material stuff. It might be people and relationships. It might be money. It might be status, fame, notoriety, power, whatever. And that stuff is weighing you down and hindering you from following Christ wholeheartedly. They're your nets. The The disciples in verses 18 and 20 immediately laid down their nets and left their families to follow Jesus. Discipleship is costly. Here in this passage, we see, here in this passage and really every passage about discipleship, we see this about following Jesus. I want you to hear this. This sentence convicts me. You can't follow Jesus with full hands and full hearts. This is what we see in all the passages about discipleship in the New Testament. That if you have full hands, whether it's like the rich young ruler holding on to the possessions of this world or disciples holding onto their nets, you can't follow Jesus well, rightly, loving and holding on to the things of this world. Can't follow Jesus with full hands and full hearts. What is it that you are holding in your hands and your heart that are keeping you from following Jesus as you were called to do? Will you leave it behind to obey and to pursue him? There's another group in here this morning, unbelievers. Maybe you've been here for a long time. Maybe you're a visitor, but you know you aren't a Christian. You've heard the gospel that Jesus died for sinners and rose again 3 days later, conquering death, but you have never followed Jesus because the cost is too high. You don't want to give up your nets, but what this passage is saying is, yes, there's a cost to discipleship, but the cost is worth it. It's worth it. Become Christians by grace through faith. We follow him with all of our heart, with all of our soul. We become his. We live a life that is just encapsulated by obedience and pursuit to Jesus. What is the cost of discipleship? Leave us with this quote this morning, just to repeat it again. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Is that true for you this morning? Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your grace and your mercy. Thank you for making people who are weak and small and frail like me your disciple. Thank you for pursuing sinners. Thank you for saving us. Lord, help us to live lives wholly committed to you, to following you. Lord, help us to lay down our nets, to be willing to leave the things of this world behind, to pursue you rightly, to obey you. Lord, give us a passion for being fishers of men. Lord, help us not to be idle, passive in sharing the gospel, Lord, but to strive and push to share the gospel with a lost and dying world, knowing that the only hope of sinners for salvation and change is you. It's your son's work on the cross. Lord, help us to feel the weight of what it is to follow after you this morning. Help us feel the weight of the call to be fishers of men. Lord, give us a zeal for the Great Commission. Lord, I pray for all those represented in the room, our loved ones, our friends, our family members, our neighbors who are not Christians. Lord, I lift them up. Lord, I pray that you would just give us fervor to reach them with the gospel, to share the gospel with them. Lord, to not sit and wait, hope the conversation goes that direction, Lord, but that we would share, that we would plead. That as Spurgeon said, that there wouldn't be anyone who goes to hell without us wrapping ourselves around their legs and pleading with them not to go. Lord, encourage us this morning. Lord, help us to live committed lives following you. It's in your name I pray. Amen.
Church, will you join us on our last song? Thank you.